We are in Vancouver, the absolute hub of the queer community in Western Canada. And although it may not look like it, it's also a fantastic place for wildlife. Today, we're going to be meeting with urban wildlife ecologist and proud queer scientist Jaylen,
who's going to be sharing their research and experiences as a queer scientist in this field. Diverse wildlife lives in even the most densely populated cities, yet these species are often underrepresented in wildlife research. And that's where urban ecologists like Jaylen come in, who study animals that thrive in human-dominated landscapes.
So yeah, I study urban wildlife ecology, so that's kind of like a big kind of umbrella category. Essentially, that just means I look at not only the interactions that happen between like wildlife and the physical landscape that they occupy, but also the social, political, and the sort of economic landscape as well that influences these sort of interactions within an urban setting.
Are there specific types of species that are more prone to come into urban spaces? Like what makes an animal urban?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, we have to look at kind of the history of urban spaces, right? And so all of the like apex, kind of like top predators have been removed, right? Yeah. So like your bears, your cougars, your wolves, these are at least here in Canada and North America. That actually creates a pretty nice environment for a lot of other individual animals a little bit lower in the trophic sort of organization of this environment to come up into this space.
Trophic levels describe where in the food chain an animal falls, and examples of lower trophic species in an urban setting are raccoons or skunks, who thrive in urban centres. Jaylen blends their work researching these species with their queer identity, and according to them, urban wildlife have a greater connection with the queer community than we might think.
I think there's kind of like this very interesting, almost an intrinsic kind of connection between queer people or the queer experience and those of urban wildlife species. For us as queer people, urban centers, urban landscapes provide us with this opportunity to find community, whether it be in queer spaces or at queer events, or even in like a lot of major cities have like entire queer neighborhoods, yeah. Right? And so in that kind of way of looking at things, you can see the direct parallels to urban wildlife because cities also offer urban wildlife species that sort of attractant, that ability to come in and establish communities. And so looking similarly how queer people are sort of our power and in community increases in these sort of urban centers, it's kind of similar in what urban wildlife are able to do.
Jaylen is actively involved in collecting data on these wildlife communities, many of which are often ignored or seen as problematic.
So I do a lot of population work with remote sensing technology, so that's wildlife cameras. And that work is mainly done here in the city of Vancouver. So essentially what we do is we spread out cameras all over the city in different land use areas, residential, industrial, commercial, urban parks, right? And they're motion sensor cameras, right? So anytime anything walks in front of it, it takes like a couple photos. We're like, great, we log that information. And what this kind of setup allows us to do is it allows us to estimate the populations of animals that live here in the city of Vancouver by specifically identifying the animals that live in specific land use areas, right? And that allows us to kind of paint a picture of what's happening across the whole city.
Jaylen's work helps to document where urban wildlife live across Vancouver, and provides important data about their intersections with human communities. Their work in wildlife sciences is also a great example of how openly queer people can study nature whilst remaining in historically safer places, such as urban communities like Vancouver. However, Jaylen emphasizes that even here, being a queer scientist is not always easy.
Oftentimes, you can be maybe the only queer or visibly queer person in these spaces. But that's not to say that there aren't queer people in these spaces, just maybe not as hyper visible or as visibly queer as someone who's like out and proud doing the thing. I know that at least in science, there's kind of this like aesthetic of like the white lab coat and like the glasses and the very like professional kind of setting, but like I don't rock that aesthetic. Like I don't have that look.
Really?
And so it's like people need to understand that like you can exist with the full range of your individuality inside of these spaces. So I think that the ability for queer people to come in and kind of account for this long history of bias towards like very white, cis, heteronormative kind of values in science, I think is extremely powerful.
Studies suggest that queer scientists drop out of science at a higher rate than their peers. With the many additional challenges and biases, it's not easy for us to be scientists. But what Jaylen shows is that when queer people have space in this field and are allowed to be their authentic selves, they can bring unique perspectives and fresh ideas that are desperately needed. And that's inspiring to see.